I arrived this morning, Chris, in a very nice way, he didn't really challenge me about it. He just pointed out that our first hymn, O Come, Emmanuel, has 7 verses. And we were trying to decide whether it was going to take 2 hours or 3 hours to sing through it. I don't know whether any of the rest of you like that hymn or not. It is one of my favorites, but also one that is most troubling to me. I always thought, and I was actually going to start this morning by pointing out that it is strange because it is a hymn written in a minor key. But then I looked at it's 1 sharp, and I'm not a musician, but I don't think that's a minor key, is it, Susan?
It's actually modal.
It is?
Modal. Yeah.
It's normal.
Modal. It's older than major minor.
Oh, it's older than major minor. That's why I didn't understand it. Anyway, the issue is, you see, that you've got this song that feels almost like a dirge when we sing it. I mean, maybe I'm the one who thinks that. But the beginning of each of the choruses is, rejoice, rejoice. And as we sing it, it doesn't sound like we're rejoicing. And that's the nature of the hymn, I think. But it got me thinking about the nature of joy, especially on this day. Joy comes to us in many places, and we find joy in many places. Ernest Lawrence Thayer named one of them, and I'm just going to read the last part of the poem that some of you are familiar with. It's one of my all-time favorites. Oh, somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. Isn't it amazing how much of our joy, at least for some people of our culture, seems to be wrapped around the whole concept of winning and losing? I guarantee you, on any given Sunday afternoon in December in this country, there will be hundreds of thousands of people who will either be rejoicing or grieving because their particular NFL football team won or lost or didn't cover the point spread. In this country, on any given Saturday from November through March Madness, hundreds of thousands of people live and die, celebrate and grieve on the basis of how their NCAA basketball team did or did not do. And it filters clear down to the local level and individual schools on the local level. See, part of the joy that we find is cultural in terms of winning and losing. Part of the joy that we find has to do with things that are much more important. Issues of health and sickness. Within 15 minutes this morning, I listened to 2 different people talk with joy, with real joy, about transplants that had happened and people were restored to health and things were going well. And you and I know that sometimes the joy is literally sucked out of our worlds because of ill health, because of changing conditions, some of which we cannot address and cannot fix, and it's an ongoing issue for folks until the day when they enter fully into the kingdom of God. Sometimes our joy is determined by our health. Sometimes our joy is determined by the economics around us, by the material possessions that we have or do not have, by the things we receive or do not receive that we can hold and possess. Sometimes our joy is determined by those kinds of material things and economic concerns. For some folks, joy is found in items. My folks came down to see us on Friday afternoon, and it was a relatively nice day. It hadn't started raining yet, and I just mentioned to my dad, who was 86, that there was a lawnmower in the shed, and my yard really needed some work if he would be willing. He reminded me that they moved into a retirement center almost 10 years ago, so he didn't have to do that kind of stuff anymore. And if anybody's free this afternoon, the lawnmower is still in the shed. One of the things after years and years of him working for a living is that I came to understand that he really finds joy in just being able to relax. in not having to open up a calendar to be at a certain place at a certain time to deal with a certain person about a certain issue. There are a lot of sources of joy in our lives, and in fact, it's such an important component of our lives that as we prepare for Christmas each year through Advent, it's one of the 4 things that we frequently focus on. Hope and joy and peace and love. It's on banners on the wall. It's hanging on the front of the communion table. It fills our lives. Why is it that on this Sunday, it doesn't feel like we live in a world of joy? How do we take a word of joy, whether it is about an athletic event or an economic situation or a health issue or retirement or whatever it is, wherever we find our joy? How do we go into the world that we live in today and sing joy to the world? To the parents of those kids who were tragically murdered in Connecticut. How do we proclaim joy in this world to folks who are facing end-of-life issues and doing so all alone? How, as a community of faith, is it possible for us to walk out these doors and into a world and proclaim joy to folks whose lives have been ended either through absence or through injury or through death on battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan and a dozen other hot spots around the world? How do we find joy living in a culture where 20% of our children live in poverty? And see, we can talk all day about why that is and about who's at fault and about whether it's a societal issue or parents that don't care or whatever. But I've never met one single person who finds joy in that kind of statistic. See, one of the things about Advent is we prepare to hear the angels singing joy to the world, and we do it in a world where it seems to me that so much of what we point to that provides joy really isn't that important. I don't know how to say this to either the Catholics in Notre Dame or the Tide in Alabama, but I don't think God really cares who wins the BCS game. I don't think that's high on his agenda this year. And I don't think God really cares whether I get everything I want for Christmas of a material nature. Where do we find the words to talk about joy to folks who have lost their joy? Sometimes because of things they've done, and often because of senseless acts by other folk. Maybe the prophet Zephaniah gives us a clue. Maybe the focus is wrong, at least in my life and maybe in the world. In the midst of those words from Zephaniah this morning, we find him saying this: "The Lord is in your midst, a mighty one who will save." And here's the key. He will rejoice over you with gladness. See, I never thought about that. I've never thought when we talk about joy that we're talking about anything but my joy. And all of a sudden, Zephaniah comes along, this prophet from years ago, and he talks about the joy that God experiences, the joy that God has because of you and I. Could it be that for the Church of Jesus Christ, in all honesty, there are times when we need to go into the world and say, this is not the time or the place to proclaim joy. The grief is too deep. The pain is too present. And the future is too uncertain. be that for the church, when we talk about focusing on joy in Advent, we're not talking about focusing on our joy, but focusing on God's joy? And so the two things that come out of that for me shape the way I see this Christmas season. One is that God took great joy in sending his Son, incarnate in the form of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, to be among us and eventually to save us. That while that ought to bring great joy into my life, it is an amazing thing that God finds joy in what God does for each of us. That God finds joy in the gift of one who can literally come to redeem the world from senseless and tragic acts of violence, from loneliness, from despair, from sickness. Maybe part of the celebration of Christmas is not the joy that I find, but a recognition of the joy of God. And the other thing that may be important about this, and I got to admit I'm still working on this one, folks, is that maybe the question of joy at Christmas is not how the joy that the angels sang in the world could be part of my life. It's not about what I have received from God through the gift of Jesus Christ. That's certainly part of it. But maybe as important is the question of how I am going to use this time of preparation to bring joy to God. What can I do as one of God's children and part of a community of faith to bring God joy? Now see, part of that means that we begin to address all of those issues, all of those points of grief and separation and loneliness and pain and sickness in the world. But because we're focusing on how to bring God joy in the midst of those, then we don't look at them from a political perspective or an economic perspective or a social science perspective or a pop psychology perspective. The question is, how can our faith reach out to help us bring joy to God in the midst of the kind of world we live in? Because I got news for you. I don't think God looked at Connecticut on Friday and felt any joy at all about what happened there. I don't think God finds joy in kids who are hungry, whether they're in Pittsburg or halfway around the world. I don't think God finds joy in war and violence and hatred and prejudice and oppression. I don't think God finds joy in a world where so often so many of your young people are tempted by a drug culture and get-rich-quick schemes and get it now. So how do we use this time of preparation? Not only to recognize the joy that God has in giving us his Son, but in finding ways that we can bring God joy as we address some of the real issues that we live with. It's going to be a tough year for a lot of people to sing with any integrity joy to the world. It really is. But I think the joy's there. The joy of a God who gives us a Son. And the joy that we can help create in response to that amazing gift as a faith community.